Good evening and welcome everyone. I hope you're well wherever you're joining us from. My name is James Kelly. I work at Pluto Press and I'm really excited to be joined by writer and activist Emily Kenway and journalist Ellie Mae O'Hagan, who's chairing tonight's event. Tonight we're here to discuss
Good
Emily's
evening
new
and
book,
welcome
which is out
everyone.
today,
I hope
The
you're well
Truth About
wherever you're
Modern
joining us from.
Slavery. This book
My name
is
is
an
James Kelly.
expert's
I work
guide to
at Pluto
understanding
Press.
modern slavery that takes on conventional narratives, revealing how anti-slavery action can act as a moral cloak and political tool for the powerful interests that benefit from our failed economic system. For those of you who haven't yet, you can head over to plutobooks.com to pick up a copy of the book. We're also running our January super sale on our website with selected books available for just £4. Remember to like and share the link to this event and subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep up to date on all of our latest content and events. This event is also going to feature a Q&A section, so please feel free to ask questions in the chat and you can tweet with the hashtag modern slavery. That's all from me. Over to you, Ellie.
Thanks, James, and thank you everybody for joining us. I'm really excited to be chairing this event and celebrating the brilliant Emily Kenway and her brilliant book. Emily is one of the most accomplished people I know. She's worked on everything from tax to modern slavery, and she's even a trained opera singer. So there really is nothing that she can't do. She's someone that I have a lot of admiration for politically, professionally, and personally. So I'm just completely delighted to be here and talk about this amazing book, which really is unlike anything I've ever read recently. Like it's a topic that I don't know that much about, and only through reading this book did I realize how misinformed I've been about the issue of modern slavery and how I've just sort of passively absorbed how it's talked about in the media without really thinking too much about it. And I think what Emily's book does is it really challenges the way that we understand modern slavery. And I think what I really like about her book is how sensitively she tackles this issue, which is obviously a very complicated and difficult issue that affects, thousands of people's lives across the world, those who have been enslaved and those who are affected by the narrative of modern slavery, even if they are not themselves enslaved. So I am not going to talk anymore because we're all here to hear from Emily. I'm just going to start by asking Emily some questions, and then we're going to move over to the Q&A. So I'm going to start with a very broad one, but also an important one. Emily, in the book, you talk about how about the term slavery, how it's a very broad term that means a range of things. So let me start by asking you quite a simple question. What is modern slavery?
Thanks so much, Ellie Mae. I am really pleased to be here tonight and just really grateful to everyone that's come along for this launch. It's really exciting. So I do talk a bit in the book about how what does modern slavery mean? And I tried not to dwell on the definitional aspects too much because there are lots of amazing legal scholars and NGO experts who spent years on that idea. Essentially, what the simplest answer, but then I'll explain what it really is. The simplest answer to what modern slavery is to say that it's a way of talking about severe exploitation. So it's an umbrella term for types of severe exploitation like human trafficking, forced labor, domestic servitude. They all have their own definitions, which we don't necessarily need to go into. The cohering factor is that these are situations of exploitation where people are in some way curtailed from leaving them. And that could be, for example, because they're being coerced or threatened, they're in debt, or because they are, for example, at risk of destitution if they leave. And when I give that last example, you can see how broad that church then becomes. So that's one of the reasons why in the early part of the book, I question whether there is this singular thing that we can be calling modern slavery. And I say, really, we're talking about exploitation. Now, that's the kind of nutshell of what are we talking about when we talk about modern slavery, which is kind of crucial for the discussion. But what I'm really doing in the book is saying modern slavery isn't just a term, it's also what's called a frame. So from cognitive linguistics, this idea that frames are mental structures that shape how we see the world. So you can imagine it like a literal frame. Okay, so there's a problem being presented to you, and someone's painted a picture of what that problem is about, the kind of characters that are part of that problem, the causes, the solutions that are there. And there are things outside that frame that are being completely left out of the picture. The way any problem is presented to us is an exercise of power in some way. So I'm saying, what is modern slavery as a story about exploitation? How is this operating across various issues and areas? And the most obvious thing to say about modern slavery, you know, when people started using this term as a way of talking about exploitation, the obvious thing to say is that it's building on connotations of historical slavery. So it's trying to capture our attention and our outrage by drawing on that idea, which, you know, works really well from a campaigning perspective, but it does other stuff too, which is really problematic. So historical slavery, in the kind of narrative used by certainly UK politicians today, is talked about as something that was like an immoral aberration, right? And an awful anomaly of history that we helped abolish, apparently. Wilberforce, you know, came in, vanquished it. And we're all against chattel slavery. And what this does is two things. It tells us that slavery is an aberration, like something separate from the whole underlying it, and that it's not a political issue, right? It's above politics, because no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you don't agree with slavery. So this then tracks through into modern slavery. The modern slavery frame that I talked about tells us that modern slavery is this uniquely bad evil, this uniquely awful type of exploitation happening in all of our communities. And it's an anomaly perpetrated by criminals, completely exceptional to the socioeconomic fabric that we're existing in. And so you see this brilliantly in the language. You know, I've worked on this, so I already thought this is why I was writing the book. But when I started researching it and finding that the language used by proponents of this frame is very much about modern slavery as a parasite. You know, they say literally a virus. We need to inoculate ourselves against it. We need to scrub supply chains clean of it, as if yeah, it's like this accidental fleck on top of something else that's fine, this rotten apple, but the barrel is absolutely fine. So the book really looks at what is modern slavery as a strategic rebranding of exploitation, and in whose favour is that working? And the answer is not the people who it purports to be helping.
I loved all of the stuff that you said about framing. That's actually the most of my work actually is working on framing, and I am going to steal some of the things that you said, because that was excellent. So you've talked there about slavery, modern slavery, in terms of how it's framed, the story that's told. But let's try and get concrete with modern slavery. How does it relate to the wider economy, and how does it touch our everyday lives, this issue?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a really interesting one that helps to expose exactly how this idea is operating so problematically. So if we take hand car washes, now you may or may not be aware that hand car washes are very much talked about in the media, by politicians, by campaign groups, as a site of a lot of modern slavery. A sector where modern slavery is thriving. There are particular sectors this is said about. So nail bars is another one, for example. Now, when you actually look at what police encounter at hand car washes when they go along to see if this is happening, yes, there are some instances where people are in situations they want to be removed from and supported out of. That does happen. But a lot more often, what the police are finding is that there is endemic labour abuse, right? So no one's being paid properly, pretty much, in a hand car wash. People, like, averages like 30 to 40 quid a day for many more hours than that would equate for the minimum wage. But when they talk to these workers, the response they often get is, well, fine, there's a minimum wage, but I don't have any other options. I don't have any better options. Like, they are in that circumstance because of a lack of alternative options, and they are essentially consenting to that exploitation, and they want the police to go away, basically, you know, unless they're going to miraculously offer them a job as like a doctor or whatever, which obviously isn't happening. So what you see exposed is, when we're told hand car washes are a cesspit of modern slavery, we're immediately thinking about like criminals, right? Like often a racialized foreign gang, traffickers, enslavers doing this bad thing. And it completely deflects from the role of the economy, from the role of economic precarity, from a lack of sufficient social safety nets, and so on. You know, there's lots, I can give you lots of examples of different kinds like that. So that's, you know, that's in the private sector on our high streets. But if you look at something called county lines, which is drug trafficking, mainly of British children. In fact, just before I came on here, I was seeing on Twitter, someone was tweeting about the government has announced like tens of millions more funding for police to tackle county lines, right? So this is a law enforcement response, because modern slavery, it's a criminal parasite, right? So that makes sense. Well, when you look even at the National Crime Agency's own analysis of who it is that ends up doing this drug trafficking, which can have like horrific elements to it, by the way, it is children with limited economic opportunities. That's what the NCA report says. So there we need to be having a conversation about poverty, about education, about genuine social mobility, these kinds of things. But the modern slavery frame tells us that, well, that's got nothing to do with it, right? Because this is like a parasite that's being perpetrated by a bad person. So you can start to see how that idea like refracts across everything that we think is going on when we're told to, you know, be vigilant of slaves in our society. And it's a really pernicious narrative.
Some of the things that you said there reminded me of the book Revolting, Prostitutes, which is a brilliant book by Juno Dawson and Molly Smith. And one thing that they point out, which is very similar to what you just said, is that the majority of sex workers they want to be sex workers because their economic position has forced them into a situation where that's the only choice that they have. They need money now. They can go out now and do sex work and get money, and so that's what they're doing. And it's consensual in the sense that that's a rational decision that they have made in the position that they're in and in the options available to them. And that sounded very similar to me to what you said about the people who are found in these hand car washes. So I was wondering, how does modern slavery and what you've talked about, how does that relate to sex work and also trafficking, which is another thing that also falls foul of this narrative of people being forced by evil people, when actually the situation is much more complex than that?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I reference Revolting Prostitutes, that book, quite a lot in one of the chapters of the book. It is a remarkably good book that's well worth reading. Yeah, so there's a couple of really interesting things in what you said that I'd like to draw out. Firstly, understanding the intersection of the modern slavery narrative with the sex industry is really crucial. So just to explain, trafficking is a particular type of exploitation that falls under the umbrella of modern slavery, and it involves, the simplest way of saying it is, it involves movement by coercing or deceiving or forcing someone in order to exploit them. It's slightly more complex, but so there's a whole chapter on the sex industry, and I have to say, like, it was kind of in some ways the most depressing chapter to write, because what's going on is so farcical. It's so crazy and harming so many people. so historically, there have always obviously been groups of people who want to eradicate the sex sector as a whole. So clearly faith groups often would have that opinion. From the 1970s onwards, you get what are called radical feminists, who also would be who would see all selling of sexual services as exploitation of women, even if those women think that they're doing it by choice. When you start to get human trafficking concerns on the rise, through after the fall of after the end of the Soviet Union, there's these like growing fears about migration, basically from east to west, and much more talk about human trafficking and risks of trafficking. And you see these groups basically pounce on this, and then they, over time, trafficking starts being talked about as modern slavery, so they pounce on modern slavery. And they pounce on this as a way of legitimising their original aim to eradicate the sex sector overall. In fact, this has got really old roots. Back in 1904, there was an international agreement on the suppression of the white slave traffic. This was the idea that white women were being abducted and forced to sell sex abroad in racialized countries like Africa. There was no evidence of this, but this agreement was ostensibly to protect, you know, fragile white women from that happening. But actually, what it does is it legitimizes countries taking details of migrant sex workers and sending them home. So you can see this like very dodgy thing occurring. So that has carried on. I mean, it's like I said, it's really depressing. We're in 2021. And you even have like such sort of patent deployments of this. So in the early 2000s, there was a umbrella faith group, let me get this right, called Churches Alert Against Sex Trafficking in Europe. And the acronym that they operated under was CHASTE, which, you know, doesn't really mean anything to do with trafficking. So clearly their interest is in like versions of sexual morality. And it's, this has shaped like a completely misinformed understanding of what's going on. So in terms of the scale of sex slaves, there's a whole bit in the chapter on this in the book, which, I mean, I know I wrote it, but I do really recommend reading that bit because it blew my mind researching it. It's not something I knew before I started researching the book, this specific bit about numbers of women in sexual exploitation and how that's been manipulated and extrapolated, and it's like mind-blowingly ridiculous. And it's basically done by conflating sex workers, especially migrant sex workers, with trafficked women. And you also see it again. I did quite a lot of freedom of information requests, a few freedom of information requests for the book, which were specifically on raids on brothels that were reported in the press and or that senior police had said was about stopping trafficking, rescuing women, modern slavery. And, you know, I wrote the book quite quickly, so I would love to do like a proper systematic thing of this with like hundreds of these raids, but I just did a few. And, you know, lo and behold, for example, 5 addresses raided in a place called Redbridge in 2019, reported as an anti-trafficking measure. How many women were referred into our national support system for victims of trafficking? 0. Same thing with 2016 raids on Soho brothels, which the chief constable said was related to trafficking. So you start to see like what's actually going on here. This is kind of a crazy circumstance, and the problem that creates is that we look at the wrong solutions. If you misunderstand the problem, how can you possibly select the right solutions? And what I tried really hard to do in the book, one of the problems with this territory is that it is very, very hostile. The topic of sex work is extremely hostile. And sometimes you end up with people who think the whole sex sector is exploitation and refuse to listen to women's voices who sell sex, and sex working women who think trafficking doesn't really happen. You do get that as well sometimes. And what I try to do in the chapters show like both are true. So I tell the story of a young lady she had a boyfriend in her home country in Eastern Europe, and he'd met her parents. everything, you know, normal relationship, several months. And they moved to his home country, and on arrival, he said, oh, I've got to go and have a business meeting, but just stay in this flat with my friends and I'll be back later today. He never came back. And she was forced into the sex industry, you know, raped multiple times a day, and eventually jumped from a window to escape. That's clearly not the same as the many, many sex workers who gave testimony to a Bristol University report on why they do sex work in the UK for reasons of like lack of alternative work. They've got caring responsibilities that's easy around, immigration status. So they've got limited options, but it is a choice. And so when we allow this narrative to take over that completely misses the distinct reality of sexual exploitation from chosen sex work, the solutions, as I say, are completely problematic, and they're ones that attempt to kill off the sector as a whole. So like criminalizing clients, criminalizing men who buy sex is like the favored one of the modern slavery brigade. And this has no evidence that it tackles trafficking. It has no evidence that it actually makes fewer women overall sell sex either. So they're not really achieving their goal. But there's endless evidence in the countries that exist that it really harms sex working women, because it basically makes their job more dangerous. They can't vet clients for as long, and so on. And so it's really vital. I think for me, that chapter, they're all important, but I feel like it's such an important chapter because I really want people to understand it's okay to feel a bit uncomfortable about sex work. It's okay to feel like outraged about trafficking for sexual exploitation, but it's not okay to use that to harm the lives of sex working women. There is a much better way of going about this, and that is to give those women rights by decriminalizing their sector, and then alongside that have an intelligent, human rights centered anti-trafficking approach. So decriminalizing sex does not mean decriminalizing rape or decriminalizing trafficking. You have both at the same time, and that's what I would really like to see.
What you've talked about there also reminded me of some of the things that Priti Patel says. You know, every time there's a sort of terrible news story about people traveling to this country and meeting harm along the way, the response of Priti Patel in the Home Office is to say, these people were trafficked, so we're going to try and close down this route to stop the traffickers. So could you talk a bit about how the modern slavery narrative relates to, I'm sure you covered this yesterday as well with JCWI, but just for our audience, could you talk about how the modern slavery narrative relates to anti-migration narratives and migration as an issue as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is one of the key pillars of the modern slavery frame, and one of the most kind of cruel elements that certainly, you know, civil society organizations who work to tackle exploitation are not part of, and are consistently trying to fight back against in policy spaces and that kind of thing. But governments around the world are being unbelievably duplicitous in regard to this. So I said earlier about that 1904 international agreement, and you can see it there, like the little seeds of it, like, oh, okay, we're talking about a slave traffic, but we're actually trying to repatriate people against their will. Interesting. You see that played out so much today. So in the UK, the very obvious example is with regard to migrants, undocumented migrants trying to reach the UK from Calais. So it's very common for politicians, I think I give the example of a Conservative, I think his name's Philip Hollowbone in the book, saying we should send them back to Calais. That will stop them trying to make the crossing and end this evil trade, this kind of thing. You're like, well, sorry, are they trying to make the crossing? You know, do they have agency, or are they victims of an awful trade and you want to send them back to the place where that's occurred? Like, how is that a coherent position? Again, you see it with one of my favorite kind of clangers of this was the former Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi, who wrote a sort of florid op-ed in the New York Times about how heartbreaking it was that so many people were drowning in the Mediterranean, blaming traffickers for that. And then suggests in the op-ed that the solution is to use anti-piracy tactics. And so that would mean sniper fire, for example, on that boat, even though he's saying that these are victims of like enslavers, you know. We saw it with Trump endlessly with the Mexico Wall, using very salacious tales about women being trafficked for sex, which people on the front line of migration there said was just like massively fabricated. So it's this consistent deployment of, we need to keep the traffickers out, therefore we need to have harder borders, which, you know, is such a no-brainer when you start seeing it that way. But often the immigration chapter, I open with the horrific death of the 39 Vietnamese people in October 2019, because I was, you know, watching that unfold and talking in the media about it, and it was so obvious what the politicians were doing, because Priti Patel immediately alluded to this as people trafficking. Now, trafficking, you need to know that those people were exploited or were intended to be exploited to say that. And at that time, certainly, I think it was like the first 2 days, they were reported as Chinese. Like there was nothing known apart from that many people have lost their lives and they may be undocumented. But she immediately started pointing towards that, because it's this idea of this kind of outside ogre that we're trying to keep out. And then you saw Conservative politicians starting bringing up stuff about lorry checks and borders in Parliament as a response. And I see sort of that in the media, and people not realizing that that's being used as a tool. You know, one of the really, I would have, again, another thing I would like to like look in, spend more time looking at, I mention it a bit in the book, but some of the things that are done in like what's called the source country, like the country someone's coming from trying to migrate. This is the thing I talk about in the book, is the Department for International Development had this project called Stamp Out Slavery in Nigeria. And what this project tries to do is stamp out people like being trafficked here by behavior change and changing their attitudes and norms about aspirational travel. Imagine, like, it's such a kind of racist position in my opinion, and like this, you know, like that's what our government department is doing in Nigeria, is trying to tell people like, oh, sometimes migration doesn't work out, as if we're not the reason why it can't work out because we have this hostile environment policy regime. The whole thing is this really kind of horrendous deployment of something that looks moral to harm the very people that it should be helping. And yeah, it's really problematic. And obviously in the UK, we have laws like the illegal working offence that make it criminal to work if you're undocumented, which again pushes people into exploitation. So it's like intimately linked.
Well, I've got like a million more questions to ask you, but I will be not selfish and not hog you. So I'm going to ask you one more question, but I just want to remind everyone that's watching that you can put your questions to Emily. I'll read them out to her. I can't see your questions. The lovely people at Pluto Press are sending them to me. So when I get them, I'll read them out to you. But my final question is, so you've talked about modern slavery, what it is and what it isn't. And I guess the question is, what would a modern abolition movement look like? You've spoken about William Wilberforce. Does that have any relevance to today's problems related to modern slavery? And what would it take to abolish modern slavery?
Small question, thanks. Yeah, well, okay, so the first thing to say is kind of, you've alluded to it with asking about Wilberforce, is like abolition of what, right, is what we need to ask about first. So as we said at the beginning, and people can read in the book, like this idea that there's a kind of homogeneous thing called modern slavery is really problematic. So working out, like, having a singular movement that tries to abolish forced begging in London, forced labour on a farm in Italy, stuff in brick kilns in Nepal, sex work in France, like, you know, clearly there's like such complexity and plurality there. But the thing that is often kind of missed from this is that clearly in 1833 what we abolished was the legal ownership of one person by another. We have never abolished exploitation, whether milder or incredibly severe. And in fact, that 1833 abolition directly led to the kinds of things today we're calling modern slavery. So plantation owners were, you know, appalled at having their supply of free exploitable labor taken away. So the replacement was the systematic shipping and exploitation of millions of Indian and Chinese workers, and the conditions on those ships were as bad as in slavery. You know, there was physical abuse on arrival. Many people died. In the Caribbean, formerly enslaved people were redesignated as apprentices who were unpaid and not allowed to leave for many years. So we abolished being able to own another person as a piece of property. We have never ever abolished exploitation, because arguably the global economy runs on it, and obviously not all of that is completely horrific, but a fair bit of it is. If we were, however, going to talk about what a modern abolition of severe exploitation movement would look like, so there's one thing that I'm just going to say and park, because the book is very much focused on the UK. I draw on other countries to kind of illuminate things, or where it's like relevant to the UK. But there are contexts in which factors like caste come into play in kind of selection of who is likely to be exploited in that society. And that would be a factor to look at in some jurisdictions. It's not really something that I talk about though. So for our purposes, a modern abolition movement, it would really be one that understands this, that vulnerability is not an inherent property of anyone. Migrants are not inherently vulnerable, as we know, because we all know that there are rich, well-protected migrants in the world. Women are not inherently vulnerable. There's no inherent vulnerability. Vulnerability is constructed by social, economic, political, cultural circumstances that we're in. So a sensible approach to trying to tackle people being exploited would be one that tries to remove those factors of vulnerability that make people exploitable, that push people into certain kinds of circumstances, and that prevent people from seeking help once they're in them. That would help a lot. It would also be a movement that is not so much focused on this law enforcement criminal justice approach, but focused on decent work, focused on rights, focused on people having a voice, focused on anti-poverty, these causal factors. You know, it's not just me who thinks this. It was quite funny a couple of years ago, the most senior police officer in the UK, who is like the lead for modern slavery in the UK, was giving evidence to Parliament and said in his evidence, I mean, the police were obviously quite frustrated because there's a lot of pressure on them to have more modern slavery act convictions and stuff. And he said, look, modern slavery is caused by the economic contract of the UK. And he then went on to be like, I'm not a communist, he actually said. I'm a capitalist. It was quite funny to watch. But he you know, the police understand. I interview in the book a really amazing police officer who used to run the Met's human trafficking and kidnap unit. And I say amazing because his insights are really valuable about, like, is it wise to be criminalizing immigration? No. Like, is this modern slavery frame helping? No. And it's worth reading for that. Yeah, and finally, so all of those things, taking away those vulnerabilities, giving rights, giving decent work opportunities, is really about options. And that's why the dedication in the book says, for all those who should have better options, because so much of this narrative is this idea that there's this big bad person forcing someone to do something without any kind of surrounding context, and also that person is ignorant. Like, they don't, the people in Nigeria who are receiving that behavioral change campaign, they just don't understand, right? When actually there's really interesting research that says people do understand. They do understand the risks. They just have to take the risks, and maybe we should be addressing that instead. So it's not, it's not a neat, the real answer doesn't make a neat poster. It doesn't make a neat app. It doesn't make a neat, light show for government, which it likes to do every year on Anti-Slavery Day. It would be a campaign about decency, options, anti-poverty.
So we've got a question from Malia Reza. I apologise, Malia, if I've pronounced your surname wrong there. What are your thoughts on supply chain transparency, and what does that look like in practice?
Thank you, Malia. I have many thoughts on supply chain transparency, and go into it a fair bit in the chapter on brands. And it is something I've worked on a lot. My thoughts aren't very polite about supply chain transparency. So for people who aren't aware, the Modern Slavery Act introduced a requirement on businesses that they have to publish a statement every year that describes, large businesses with a turnover of 36 million or more, every year, that describes what steps, if any, they are taking to tackle modern slavery in their operations and supply chains. And so what I explain in the book is that this is basically a perfect example of the problematic ideology we're living under, because it completely leaves up to companies what steps, if any, they take. It doesn't mandate anything other than the production of that statement. And what we've had in the UK, and by the way, this bit of legislation, it was kind of borrowed from a Californian one that's similar, but we're now exporting it around the world. What we've had in the UK is this ridiculous merry-go-round of trying to make that bit of legislation be meaningful. So, for example, trying to get government to introduce sanctions to companies that don't even bother to publish this statement that they don't even have to do anything about. In 2019, 1/3 of the government's top 100 suppliers who should have done these statements didn't do them, of the government, central government's own suppliers. So there's been this jamboree of trying to improve compliance with this piece of legislation. And I think it's, and I've been part of it, I think it's really distracted from the fact that this is not a useful bit of legislation. There are some companies that have used it to do impressively leaderly things, like disclosing factory lists, which, really opens them up to scrutiny. But in general, it's like you're allowing the perpetrators to dictate the terms of their own rehabilitation, which, is a bit of an odd, well, I don't know anything about restorative justice, but, it's a bit of an odd thing to do. And when you think about, so Malia, what I would really say is there is a role for transparency in terms of I think factory lists are a good thing, although of course that doesn't actually tell us, the detail of what's going on there. But for me, transparency is a way of deflecting from the changes we really need to see in relation to supply chains, and that's about business models. So you have brands massively underpaying suppliers, for example, which pushes labour conditions down in supply chains, or leads to dodgy subcontracting to incredibly precarious workers, or where there's agencies coming in and nobody knows what the working terms for those workers are. Why are we not regulating what's called purchasing practices, which is when brands are kind of paying to suppliers? Instead, they've got a piece of paper that says that they will try and tackle modern slavery, or yeah, you can kind of see this abounding across the corporate space, that there's a lot of corporate modern slavery activity, and essentially it all avoids touching the core business model that is driving this harm. And what I would just add is sometimes people then get say, hang on, but you're talking about general labor abuse and we're meant to be talking about modern slavery. Well, that, if you're thinking that that is the modern slavery frame in operation, because you know, the reality is research shows, you know, the UN Special Rapporteur has confirmed that when you have an economy with labor abuse allowed to thrive, you create a breeding ground for the most severe forms. I think of it as you've gone out of the house and you've left your doors and windows all open, right? By having the business models the way we do, by having a lack of labor law protection. And then you come back and you're like, oh my gosh, we've been burgled. Yeah, like that's what we're doing with the modern slavery narrative. And like we need to close the doors and the windows, which is about fundamentally changing business models and rebalancing power between workers and employers.
We've got some great questions coming in. The next one is from Kieran. I would like to know the answer to this as well. Do you find it frustrating that so much money and attention in the space goes towards abolition-focused NGOs and projects? How can this be challenged and improved, if at all?
Yeah, thank you, Kieran. I do. Well, okay, I'm going to caveat this. There are some really incredible organisations, particularly frontline services, who are working with people who've experienced exploitation, supporting them into different paths in life, supporting them against the odds because of basically government support not being good enough, government not giving them the right to remain in the UK if they're undocumented migrants. So, you know, I certainly would not include them in a comment about where funding is going. If anything, they should be supported far more in many ways. But yes, this favouring of new abolitionist organisations, so organisations that really frame themselves as freeing the slaves, as you know, this kind of crusade attitude that is solely focused on this idea that there's a uniquely, exceptionally bad thing that they're trying to kind of raid and rescue, which often, you know, really harms people it's done to, because they will not have done their due diligence on whether those people have other options and that kind of thing. I think it is the problem is the reason why the modern slavery frame is so clever. It's so it succeeded so well. Like even Ellie, when you were saying at the beginning, like you didn't realize how misinformed you were. That's part of the reason I wrote the book. I wrote it because I want, you know, people who don't know about this to read it and to like learn about it, but also specifically because of people kind of on the left of the spectrum. I could see that this has just been taken in, and you can see Labour politicians and stuff sort of talking about modern slavery as if it is this thing that's not about party politics, when of course it's about power, it's about immigration policy, it's about all these things. And so the problem is it's a really successful way of talking about severe exploitation because it protects business as usual. It can be deployed by government in ways that they clearly like, and it's like sensationalist and, you know, attention grabbing. There's an academic who's worked on this for many years, who I mentioned a couple of times in the book, called Joel Quirk. And one of the things he says is, so there are these fairly ridiculous numbers of how many slaves there are in the world. And I explain in the book a little bit about what's so wrong with these big numbers. And he says, well, you know, one of the things that would probably be better than quantifying kind of something unquantifiable and doing it in a really bad way is measures of like poverty and education levels, these kinds of things. But of course, that's not going to create, I mean, I agree with him entirely. It would be more useful for actually trying to solve something, but that's not going to create the kind of there's 40.3 million slaves in the world today apparently, and there are more slaves now than ever before. Like, neither of those things is what you think it is. But it's just a frame that creates these like sexy media friendly statements. So it's unbelievably frustrating. I think that for me, one of the only things I can see as a solution to this, other than like writing books that try to expose it, is so there's a really big problem in the space of campaign groups and policy making on this topic, which is the absence of people who have actually experienced exploitation. Thankfully, there's an incredible organisation called Survivor Alliance that's just starting up, that's trying to, you know, remedy some of that. They have if you Google Survivor Alliance, you find their website, and I think they have a donate button, and they're wonderful. The more we can have the voices of people who've experienced what we're talking about in spaces that are making decisions about NGO strategies, that are making decisions about government policies, the better outcome we will inevitably get, because those people are best placed to understand what they need and what has gone on and how it has occurred, rather than people who have all the options making it up. And that is my kind of hope for how we could turn the tide of this narrative, but it's, who knows?
So we have two similar questions here from, so I'm going to bunch them together, from Richard and Matthew. So I'm going to compress it into one question. And the question is, what do we do about the modern slavery narrative beyond reading your book? Should we stop using the modern slavery frame altogether, or should we focus on different individual types of severe exploitation? And apology for the door knock that you might have heard then, someone just knocked at my door.
I didn't hear it, but thanks. Yeah, so this is a question that's come up quite a lot in response to the book. And I think it's a question of tactics at this point, and it's a question that I'm, you know, not alone in asking or generating. It's one that many people who've been in this space for a long time, a lot longer than me, many of them have been starting to ask a lot more. So there's an extent to which, because I said like modern slavery is this really like eye-catching phrase, that in a way it can be useful to draw attention to those causal factors that cause exploitation, because how many news articles are you going to see about decent work? And I mean, that's a shame, you know, that's something about the society we're living in. But I think tactically that's where things have been for a number of years, with those who recognize the truly systemic nature of exploitation. That's how it's been being deployed. But I think that now we've got to a point where it is being used so duplicitously and cynically that it is undermining those overall aims, and it is harming the changes that we actually need to see. I think we need to be just talking about exploitation. I don't personally think there is enough coherence across the things that are lumped under modern slavery to call it a thing. You know, one of the spaces I think that becomes most obvious is in like private relationships and homes, because forced marriage comes under the modern slavery moniker. It's in that 40.3 million number I said. But at what point in a home life does a kind of normal but power unequal marriage become domestic servitude, which is where you're forced to provide services and live in someone's house, basically? Like, there's plenty of romantic abusive marriages that could fit that. You start to see that we're talking about something that's way too plural. So I think we do need to put it down. I think we need to challenge the component parts. We need to challenge the idea that exploitation is caused by criminals, and instead, in the same way that's been done with lots of issues, talk about how it is socially produced, how it is economically produced. And we need to then probably talk about different factors differently. For example, I was answering Malia's question about big brands. Obviously, I then need to have a totally different conversation and response to County Line's drug trafficking of children. The idea that we're lumping them together is not really helpful or intelligent. And I think that, yeah, it's really the time that we put this down, especially because too many people think modern slavery is not a political issue. And we can't get anywhere unless people start recognizing that this is about political questions. This is about immigration policy. This is about failure to regulate big brands, these kinds of things. So yeah, we really need to like repoliticize what we're talking about and probably talk about it in terms of exploitation instead.
Related, that segues nicely into the next question, which is a political question. It's from Dylan. How does the UK asylum and immigration system and no recourse to public funds contribute to creating modern slavery inside the UK? And could I ask as well that you start by explaining what no recourse to public funds mean, just in case some of our viewers aren't familiar with it?
Yes, so no recourse to public funds means like what it sounds like you can't access state support, basically. We've seen it come up a lot in relation to COVID because there's lots of people who can't get sick pay. So they can't take time off work when they've got symptoms, which obviously does nobody any favours. So it relates intimately to asylum, immigration, these kind of factors. Partly for the reason I said earlier about vulnerability being something that's constructed, and those systems directly constructing vulnerability. So when someone can't access forms of state support, they are obviously at risk of destitution if they're not earning money. And that is going to prevent them from the crucial thing that we all hope to have in our life, which is the privilege of saying no to bad work, to harmful labour conditions. And that is removed. There's a man I talk about in the book briefly who he's actually British, but this would completely apply to someone who has no recourse to public funds, who he was at a homeless shelter. Homeless shelters are known recruiting grounds for people seeking to exploit someone, because what you have there, you have very exploitable people who are like lacking in support in some way and highly vulnerable for various reasons. And this man told his story to the BBC, and he was offered a job. It sounded good, 3 meals a day. He got there and was like severely maltreated for many years. And once he realized the situation he was in, he says that he thought, well, what shall I do? Should I try and run away? And he decided to choose the lesser of two evils, which was to stay, because his choice was between some food and no food, shelter and no shelter. And clearly that's like directly applicable to people that are completely prevented from accessing state support in any way. It does none of us any favours. It's a choice to criminalise people on the basis of where they're from and whether they have the right paperwork. I feel like obviously the whole migrant rights movement knows that, but I think as a society as a whole, we're just like taking it as a thing that's like normal, and it's not sort of a given throughout history. And one of the most problematic things that's happening with regard to this intersection is the hostile environment policies we have in place that basically criminalise migrants and therefore put them at the mercy of people who want to take advantage. And so, for example, it is documented that dodgy employers will directly coerce workers into worse and worse conditions by saying that you can't do anything about it because you're illegal. And those people know that they can't call labour inspection safely or the police safely because they know they could be detained and deported. So you have what one of the people I quote in my book calls easy prey. That is directly constructing, and the duplicity of government in this regard. In 2016, when that criminal offence of working without the right paperwork was introduced, the government had this line that they started saying everywhere, like the minister then was saying it was in like Home Office spokesperson was saying it to the BBC, it was in government documents, and it was this. Using illegal labour exploits workers. That was what they were saying everywhere. It was their soundbite. And that's not true. What exploits people is having the category of illegal labour in the first place. But you can see then, it's why I think at the start of the chapter that's in, I use Orwell's quote, political language is designed to make murder respectable. Because that is immigration policy in modern slavery to a T, that quote, and sometimes literally. Yeah, the final thing to say on that, Dylan, is that, as you may be aware, one of the major problems with this is that government loves to talk a good talk about how we are saving victims of modern slavery. But if you have the misfortune to be a victim who is not of the right nationality, you do not get the right to stay in the UK. Very few of, used to be non-EU, now EU2, get the right to stay in the UK after going through our support system. So then many people have to do a separate asylum claim. But yeah, I mean, we regularly detain and deport people that are recognised by the state as victims of modern slavery, including children. So yeah, it's a big and depressing mess.
Classic, forget to unmute. So we have another question from someone whose YouTube username is Ms. JCR. I'm going to guess she says, migrant interests are often pitted against citizens' interests. Are there implications of your argument for how we should talk about the economy to overcome this?
That feels like a massive question. But yes, of course, is the answer. There's a book by an immigration lawyer called Colin Yeo, Y-E-O. What's it called? Welcome to Britain. That came out, I think, last year. And he talks in this about we need to start seeing migrants as citizens in waiting. I don't know what that will actually mean in practice, and that's not a criticism of him at all. This is a massive, unwieldy topic that no one has a straightforward solution to. But I think it's an interesting way of thinking about things because it strikes right to the heart of what this question is about, which is that we've got this deeply problematic opposition set up, and we need to find a different way of thinking and talking about it. Otherwise, we just go round and round in circles. It also completely fails to take reality into account. So, for example, there's no evidence that hostile environment policies prevent people from coming here undocumented or have made people leave. Clearly, there is work for people who don't have the right paperwork because many of them are working. So clearly there's a mismatch between our ideals of who gets to work versus the actual economic appetite. So, I mean, the answer is yes, but it's incredibly complex, and I don't think I have all the answers. I think it's going to take a really long and complex time to sort out.
I can actually offer a little answer, which is with my strategic comms hat on, which is to check out the work of Anat Shankar Azorio on the race-class narrative and also narratives on asylum. Her firm is called ASO Communications. That's just the letters ASO, and she has all of her research on her website, and it does look into how we deal with that. So I would recommend looking at that. And then we've got one final question, which is a good question. It is kind of a doozy, but I like it. And it's from Leah, who asks, how could border abolition tackle trafficking?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So one thing to say that's often misunderstood about trafficking is that trafficking doesn't have to be across international borders. Legally, something can be a crime of trafficking if it's happening inside a country. So just to make that distinction, obviously there is trafficking that occurs across international borders, which is what your question's about, but for people who might find that useful to know. Yeah, clearly a world without borders is a world in which no one is going to be illegal when they move. And therefore, this would be an incredibly helpful tool for tackling trafficking, because the modern slavery narrative tends to be understood as someone being trafficked predominantly when they are like kidnapped, abducted, forced against their will, or like the example I gave earlier of the lady who was forced into sexual exploitation, who was completely like deceived, right? That's like a very common, the public imaginary says that that's what happens with trafficking. Actually, the majority of trafficking is much better understood as migration gone wrong. So people want to migrate, they lack legal and safe ways in which to do that, and they end up being trafficked. So for example, they may pay a smuggler. Smuggling is the movement of someone across international borders for profit. So it's like very related, but there's not an exploitation element. And then through sort of starting that pathway, they end up being exploited on the way, because they're obviously highly vulnerable, because you're you know, regarded as illegal by countries. You can't seek help, you can't show your face, you can't earn money, you can't get any form of help. So it would remove that constructed vulnerability that we see created by borders. However, and the thing that's kind of like uncomfortable sometimes with this topic, and I do go into this a little bit in the book, there are plenty of instances of trafficking that occur when someone is not moving illegally, when someone is not undocumented. So I give the example of a man who was offered a job in, he was in Bangladesh, he was offered a job in the UK and took it to be a chef. He had a wife and a baby he was struggling to support back in Bangladesh, and he got offered this job by this guy, and heartbreakingly he says about it, I fell into his big hope trap, which I just find like the most heartbreaking phrase. And on arrival, he ended up working in a Scottish hotel, 22 hours a day, 7 days a week, no pay, and it escalated into physical violence. And he was in the UK legally. There are plenty of people in the UK with what the government deems to be legality who are then in this situation. So yes, border abolition would be helpful with regard to certain forms of this, but it is also not a wholesale solution. And I think that comes back to this idea that this is not a homogeneous thing. We're basically talking about people treating each other people really horrifically. And if you put it like that, why would one thing solve all the component parts of it? And yeah, so I also think, yeah, I mean, we're obviously so far away from that being what could happen. And therefore, I do say in the book, like, we do need a way of thinking about borders now that tries to mitigate and prevent people becoming so vulnerable, because, you know, we're so far away from that version of things.
It's perfect timing for this to end because my cat has just woken up. So he's going to be going crazy now, and probably make this event impossible. So it's fortuitous that it's just come to an end. If you can hear scratching, that's my cat. Thank you very much, Emily. That was absolutely fascinating. And I really learned a lot. And I'm sure that people listening to this have as well. I really urge you, if you haven't already, buy the book. It's The Truth About Modern Slavery by Emily Kenway. It's from, you can get it on Pluto Press's website, and they also have a sale on. And if you have any spare cash after that, donate to Survivors Alliance. Thank you to the wonderful folks at Pluto Press for doing such a great job of the tech. Thank you to you for joining us, and thank you most of all to Emily Kenway for a brilliant book and a brilliant discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.